in the American colonies, 1607 to 1750, whatever. Doesn't matter. Anyway, before I get to the Navigation Acts, I'm going to talk about mercantilism first. So mercantilism is sort of one of our watchwords for early American colonial economics. So basically the idea behind mercantilism is that English colonies exported raw materials only to England. And the idea here is that under a mercantile system, colonies exist to enrich with money their mother country. Okay, so that's the main principle of mercantilism, is that colonies exist to enrich their mother country. And so under that system, English colonies can only export raw materials to England. They're not allowed to trade with anybody else. And so that was the kind of de facto system that was in place in the early American colonies. And what ended up happening is the colonies continued to trade with the Spanish and with other people as well, and the French and stuff. That was just the colonists. That wasn't official British policy. So that became a problem for the British government. And so that brings us to the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts were a whole set of trade laws passed. You can see that there's 4 different iterations here. So you start here in 1651, and then they're passing Navigation Acts all the way up to 1733. So, this is almost a 100-year process of the British government cracking down to maintain their trade monopoly with the American colonies. So at first, it starts by saying anything going anywhere else can only be transported on English ships. Not the end of the world. Colonies can only export sugar, tobacco, cotton, and indigo to England. Here's the thing. All of those crops are cash crops. Those are their big money makers. And now the British government is saying you can only send that stuff to England. Then, 1663, you come to all the goods have to pass through English ports where a tax was collected. Again, more money lost. And then finally in 1733, those duties are increased, specifically on sugar. And so that's more money. So basically what the British government is trying to do is make as much money go into their pockets as possible and as little money into the pockets of the colonists. Because the reason they're doing this is because they need to keep the colonies dependent. If the colonies develop their own independent economy, then they have no need for Britain. So the goal here is to keep the colonies as dependent on Britain as they possibly can. That's the whole purpose behind the Navigation Acts. In addition to making money for the British government, it's this. It's you got to keep the colonies dependent on Britain, because if the colonies aren't dependent on Britain, then what's to stop them from rebelling? And inevitably, obviously, this ends up biting them in the butt. But that's a topic for the next unit. So we did mercantilism already. So now you've got your 3 region of colonies in terms of what they're able to do. So you've got New England with its just crappy agricultural environment with the cold winters and crappy soil and all that other stuff. You've got the middle colonies. They're a little bit better off. They've got temperate climate and they've got a longer growing season and some good land. The southern colonies, they're the stars. They've got the temperate climate. They've got the longest growing season, and they've got a landscape with lots of fields and lots of space. So that's where we're at geographically. So New England, because it can't grow stuff for itself, has to develop a different economy. And so what it does is it develops fishing, lumber, and small-scale farming. But the key here for New England is what we call economic diversification. And the reason that this is important is because it means that their economy depends on more than one industry. And that's good, because if they have a bad growing season, that doesn't mean that their economy is going to collapse. Whereas the South, that's exactly what happens. If they have a bad growing season, their economy goes into recession. Whereas in New England, there's other stuff that can pick up the slack. So the economic diversification of New England is extraordinarily important. And we'll come back, as another sort of fuel of eventual sectional differences and stuff like that in the 1800s. But getting ahead of myself here. Middle colonies becomes the breadbasket. So they're the stuff, that's all food. That's what the middle colony sells. That's what they grow. Staple crops, subsistence farming, stuff that you live off of. And then the southern colonies, That's where the cash comes in. So you've got, money here, and then the middle colonies are feeding everybody. So that's really how it works. But again, the important takeaway here is this economic diversification from the New England colonies. That's going to be huge moving forward. And I drew some boxes on the map to show you what I'm talking about with middle and southern colonies, and I forgot that they were there. And so now this is just stupid. All right, New England. Few African Americans. Slavery is a thing, but it's not obviously as widespread as the South. You have more families and a rapid population growth. And again, that's another big trend that's going to impact the different development of the different colonial regions. You also have more economic equality, which also leads to more social mobility in the North or in the New England colonies than is available in other places. You get towns and local schools, and so New England has that rich history of public education that you guys are benefiting from now. Middle colonies, you've got a much more diverse population, and the reason for that is, you've got Quakers here, and you've got Scottish people, you've got Irish people, you still have Dutch people living in New York, you've got English people in Jersey, and English people and Scandinavian people living in Delaware. So it's a lot of diversity in terms of what the types of people. Also more religious tolerance, and then because you have both. Because you've got both New York and, all of its merchant trading area here in Manhattan, and you've got Pennsylvania, you have a variety of economic opportunities as well. So middle colonies also have that economic diversification going for them too, much like the New England colonies do. But even still, they're mostly reliant on farming. Then, of course, you've got the South, where slaves were the majority of the population. And that's the key, is that they're the majority. White people are outnumbered by slaves. By the time you get to the Civil War, it's like something like 2 or 3 to 1. They're outnumbered, and population is spread out over large areas. So you don't really there's no towns, there's no concentrated settlement. You have very little economic equality, and, obviously no schools, no churches, because no towns, they're all spread out all over the place. In terms of women, what their job is in the early economy of the colonies, maintaining the home is their primary job. Also known as, they oversee what's called the cottage industry, which is basically manufacturing goods in the home. That's part of what the women do. Obviously they can't vote, they can't hold political office or serve on juries. They also can't own property. And that's another thing. But in some states or some colonies, a widow could inherit part of the husband's estate. But primarily, role of woman is to maintain the home and raise the children. That's their job. In terms of education, schools were required in all New England towns by the mid-1600s. So this is unique in the colonies. And New England is going to be at the head of the public school sort of train in the colonies and in later the United States from the get-go. They require public schooling. And outside of New England, you have homeschooling, which is common, and the girls attended these things called dame schools. And wealthy people are going to hire private tutors, or they're going to send their kids back to England. But the interesting thing here is this last bullet here. Most colonists ended up better educated than the average European because they just had more access. That's the thing, is that the colonists just had more access to education than your average European did. Europeans, your average person, they're not going to college. They're not going to school. But the colonists are. They are getting at least some kind of education. And the whole reasoning behind this is for people to be able to read the Bible. That's why. That's why. All right. I think that's it. That's it for now. Ta-ta.